Masal khair. Welcome. Thank you for being here. So let me start calling for the panelists one at a time. She is the first lady who put her name to be a president of Somalia. Okay, she is a social justice fighter. Okay, not just in our own country, in Africa and other places. Please welcome my fellow jury board member, Fadumo Dayib. She is a very well-known journalist. I don't want to bring the name CNN into it, but she's a great journalist, and when it comes to this subject, I cannot think of a better person in the industry who knows about this subject firsthand, who's been involved, and she's done a great job. And actually, she created her own foundation, which is INARA. I'm sure she's going to touch upon that too, which is to go with the refugee issues. So please give a big hand for Arwa Damon. Last but not least, my namesake. I first met him at Davos. Most of us at Davos are boring people, especially when we are academicians. Interestingly, this gentleman was very interesting. I don't want to say that the World Economic Forum says so, but I would say it too. He is the specialist that I will go to when it comes to this subject. I cannot get much better person than Dr. Khalid Koser to come and join us, please. I'll start with you, Khalid. If you can set the scene. There is a lot of what we call fake news, wrong news, sort of emotional news which goes around. But please set the scene where we're coming from and where we're going to, okay? And the issue of this Arab, non-Arab factor.
Khalid, let me start my namesake by thanking you for inviting me to speak here this evening and to join this wonderful reception. I admit this is the first time I've heard about TAKREEM, and I'm overwhelmingly impressed by the work that you're doing and look forward to staying in touch with you and your colleagues as you take forward this immensely important work. I'm humbled to be going first on this panel because I'm with panelists who are far more expert and far more eloquent and far more experienced than me, but Khalid has invited me to perhaps set the scene for our discussion. I do, if I may, want to start with a few words about my current organization where I work. It's a Geneva-based organization, the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, and our work focuses on preventing violent extremism. And the interesting reference to 9/11 in the video we just watched. Our approach is fairly straightforward. It seems to us that rather than focusing on security and military responses to terrorism, which we know have unintended consequences and often don't work, would it not make more sense to work with young people who feel marginalized, who feel they have no future, who feel they may be tempted to join terrorist groups and provide better alternatives for those people? And that's the work that we try to do around the world through my organization. But I won't speak about that for now. I simply want to make a few points to set the scene on this very important subject of refugees, of forced migration. I'll start with Ukraine because Ukraine is, of course, on everybody's mind. I think Ukraine does matter, and I think it matters for at least three reasons. One is the numbers. We are talking about something like 6 million people who have left Ukraine over the last 75 days or so. This is a staggering number of people who have been displaced from Ukraine. Secondly, Ukraine matters because it's a European refugee crisis, which is immensely unusual, as you know from the part of the world where you come from, many of you. The last time we had a European refugee crisis was in the mid-1990s, the Bosnians and the Kosovans, and before that, World War II. So in historical terms, this is a very unusual geographical setting for a refugee crisis. And thirdly, I think Ukraine matters because we are seeing very surprising levels of hospitality. As you know, and I think Arwa will discuss this, all too often Europe has been very hostile towards refugees, and I welcome the fact, although I recognize the double standards, but I welcome the fact that for Ukrainians we are seeing immense hospitality from governments and from civil society in Europe at the moment, and I think that is to be applauded. So Ukraine matters for those reasons. But I do want to put Ukraine in a wider global context as well, lest we forget that there is a much greater refugee crisis than that is unfolding in Europe. Let's just look at the global context for forced migration and for refugees. Firstly, the numbers. At least 30 million refugees around the world today, and that includes, of course, at least 5 million Palestinians, the great forgotten refugee population of Palestinians. Half of those refugees under 18. 15 million children are refugees in the world today. We are talking about refugees in sub-Saharan Africa. We'll hear from my colleague in Somalia. We're concerned about Afghanistan and further flows from Afghanistan in the near future. We know what's happening in Myanmar, Burma, whichever terminology you wish to choose. Large numbers of people, and this is the key point and the second feature I want to emphasize. The burden of refugees absolutely falls on the global south. And the numbers in Ukraine and the political attention to Ukraine should never allow us to forget the fact that the refugee crisis is a crisis of the global south and not Europe. And I think that's very important to make. The third point I'd make about the global context, which I think, again, is in stark contrast to what we're seeing in Ukraine, is I fear that refugees around the world are facing an increasingly inhospitable atmosphere. Governments are closing their borders. People are showing a lack of tolerance and a lack of sympathy towards refugees around the world and not just in Europe. So in many ways, Ukraine stands out as an unusual example in the world today. Three final points very quickly. I want to think about some challenges. Again, we might wish to discuss this. For me, there are three main challenges around refugees in the world today. One, and it's the population we always forget, is internal displacement. I won't go into the detail, but refugees are people who have crossed international borders. There are about 30 million of those. Internally displaced people are people who are fleeing for their lives but haven't managed to cross a border. And there's at least 100 million of those. And they are largely forgotten and largely unassisted, and I think largely the challenge that we face. A second challenge is that an increasing number of refugees find themselves in an intractable, protracted situation. Around half of the refugees that we count, 30 million or so, have been refugees for at least 20 years. Imagine that. A generation of people who are living in refugee camps with no future and no hope. And of course, the unfortunate overlap with the work that I do around violent extremism is there to be thought about. And the third challenge, of course, solutions. And it is clear that the world has run out of solutions. There are three solutions traditionally for refugees. One is that they integrate locally and stay permanently in the countries where they arrive. Most of our countries are unwilling to do that. The second is that they move to a third country, Canada, Australia, the United States, a few Nordic countries. Very few people are lucky enough to get that solution. And the third solution is repatriation, that people go home. Repatriation basically is not taking place at the moment. So we have more and more refugees fleeing their countries, staying in refugee camps with no foreseeable future for them. We need to find new solutions. One word on the future, and then I'll conclude. The future is clearly climate change when we discuss forced migration. We need to note that there are some great myths about climate change. There is still a fear in Europe that climate change means that millions and millions of Africans will be arriving in Europe, crossing the Mediterranean boats, the sorts of things you read about in the press. Now, there is still a degree of uncertainty. We're not quite sure how quickly climate change will become obvious. We're not quite sure about the interactions between climate change and migration. But I think we can be absolutely sure that as climate change takes a grip and as more and more people leave their homes, they'll be leaving countries in the south and moving to countries in the south. Climate change will increase the burden on the global south of refugees. I do want to finish, if possible, saying something positive. It's quite hard to find something positive out of this topic. That lovely line that we heard in the video, making the impossible possible. Are these challenges insurmountable? I just want to leave you with three thoughts or ideas. One is, many of you will have visited refugee camps. I certainly have visited refugee camps. I want to remind you or tell you that I have never seen as much entrepreneurship and positivity in the world than I have amongst refugees and in refugee camps. And I think this is an incredibly important point to make. We must never, ever mistake material poverty for spiritual poverty. Some of the poorest people in the world are some of the spiritually richest people in the world. I think that's positive, and I think that's true. A second point that perhaps is positive is that we can make a difference. This is not insurmountable. This is not avoidable. I'd say you have to do three things. We have to have an honest debate. Some people are scared of refugees, some people welcome refugees. Let's not hate each other, let's not be extremists, let's have a serious, open debate about what's positive, about what the challenges are, about where the opportunities are, and what we can do. And I fear that in the world today, the space for that debate is shrinking, and we need to preserve that space in places like this. Let's have an honest, open discussion. Let's respect one another's points of view, even if we disagree with them. Secondly, of course, you can make a difference to climate. Get a tram home tonight. Don't drive your car. Try to control your flights. These things, I think, ultimately do matter. Individuals have a responsibility about climate, which, of course, has ramifications for refugees. And thirdly, through foundations such as TAKREEM, we can make a difference by lending our support to excellent foundations like TAKREEM that I think are empowering champions to make a difference. And the third positive point I would leave on, if I may, and if I may be so bold as to say this, is your country. Because Lebanon stands out as an absolute champion in the way that it has received and looked after and cared for Syrian refugees, at least 2 million of them, despite the challenges in your country that we've heard about. So we have a real challenge in the world today. I think we have a pretty grim prospect going forward, but there are positive things for us to seize hold of and to hold on to dearly, and let's please do that together.
Thank you very much, Khalid. Thank you. That's you left a lot for us to think about. Now, let me, Arwa, I mean, some of the things that Khalid spoke about, you've been involved on the ground, whether they are sort of refugees coming across the border or refugees displacement in their own country. Give us a feel from where you stand with what's going on in Syria, along with what goes on in Ukraine.
Yeah, sure. First of all, I'm really grateful that you added that positivity in the end, because I was about to crawl under that table and just curl up and give up. I mean, seriously. No, all joking aside, so I've covered a number of different refugee crises on the ground, whether it's, you know, an exodus out of Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or most recently Ukraine. And if I start with Ukraine, I have to say that when I arrived to the Ukrainian-Polish border, I was stunned, because that is the way that we need to be responding to people in need. And by that, I mean, there were mountains of clothes, like piles taller than I am. And okay, fine, I'm like a bit short, but like still, that's a lot of clothing. That's a lot of donations. That's a lot of people coming forward and saying, hey, how can I help? As the Ukrainian refugees came across the border, there were people waiting with signs, offering free rides, warm places to stay, transportation. At times there were more volunteers in any one given spot than there were actually refugees themselves. And I remember being quite struck by a couple of the images, because I saw parents walking towards me, holding their children's hands, and I saw the children stumbling because they were so tired, dragging these suitcases. And my mind just automatically put the same image right in front that I had seen when I was covering the Syrian refugee exodus back in 2015, where I walked across borders with them, watching how they were blocked, how they were tear gassed, how they were being held quite literally at gunpoint in fields so that they would not be allowed to advance. And of course, the one question does become, why such a difference in one place? And yes, of course, it is down to racism. It is down to fear of the other. It is down to all of these factors that we need to actually confront right now and ask ourselves, why did this happen? But on top of what we saw happening, you know, in Ukraine and the way that the West has responded to Ukraine, I think something else that we need to acknowledge, you know, as Arabs, and I'm half Arab, so I'll be speaking from that perspective, is why did we as Arabs not respond when our own were being displaced? Why did we not drive to the border and offer Syrians or Iraqis or whoever it may be rides to somewhere warm, or homes, or food? And it might be a tough question to have to answer, but we really need to ask that of ourselves. And on the flip side of that, the West, or a Western individual who did feel compelled to get up and drive from their home to a neighboring country of Ukraine needs to ask themselves, why did I feel motivated by witnessing that in that country and not feel the same level of compassion when I witnessed it somewhere else? And unless we can answer these questions for ourselves, we're not going to start making a difference. And it's ugly to have to confront certain realities about the way that we operate, but we have to do it now. We know people are dying. Afghans cannot leave their country. Literally, they are in prison there. We didn't see an exodus out of Afghanistan after the Taliban took over because Afghans couldn't leave the country. And those that did manage to get out, they had to walk through Iran, and I covered this as well. They would cross from Iran into Turkey, where, by the way, Europe is paying for a wall, which makes it 10,000 times harder for them to get across, schlep through mountains, get chased down by Turkish security forces, get detained, and even though they've crossed into Turkey and are deep enough into Turkey where they should technically be allowed to stay and have their asylum claim be processed in terms of moving elsewhere, they were being forcefully deported back to Iran. And the other big topic of conversation, I also think needs to be how we all, and we, I also include us in the media, frame our conversations around conflict. If we take Ukraine again for an example, there was all sorts of military analysis and political analysis about what was going to happen and the dynamics and how Europe's going to be impacted and where is Germany going to get its gas, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody was talking about the impact of the potential humanitarian crisis, not in Ukraine, but elsewhere. Where were we going to be sourcing the grain? 60% of Lebanon relies on imported grain from Ukraine and Russia, 25% of Yemen, even more factors. Famine is going to be another big one, and famine is also compounded by climate change. So I'm not an optimist, so I don't have anything positive to say right now, but no, I'm kidding. I mean, I'm not kidding about not being an optimist, I'm not, but I do have something positive to say, because these conversations matter. What you do here matters, your presence here matters, but what matters even more is what you do when you walk out of this room. So,
thank you very much. Give us from your perspective, I mean, you come from that part of the world, which is feeling it much more than, as Khalid was saying, the South is going to be getting it the hardest. So give us your view, please.
Well, I think I would want to humanize the numbers that were just given. I am actually one of those refugees and have been for more than 30 years. And I actually went to Finland along with my two younger siblings. And they were underaged. So we were child, refugees. And later on, when we were joined by my mother, she always had her suitcase unpacked and right by the door, thinking that Somalia was going to be okay, she would go back. She unfortunately didn't. She died in Finland. There are many cases like that. And when I went to Finland, I had less than 5 years of formal education, primary and secondary schooling combined. And I was entering my 18th year. The Finnish government didn't say, this is a useless refugee, what are we going to do with her? They directed me to go and do vocational schooling. And from there, I went on to do other things. So, because Finland took refugees in, despite them coming from a country like Somalia, we don't share the same religion, we don't share the same language. In other parts of the world, for example, in Saudi Arabia, Somalis who were there were being actually deported back to Somalia. And one of those people actually jumped off the ship and drowned because they didn't see a future in Somalia. So whereas Muslim countries were not welcoming, they were actually not opening the doors for Somalis and people that perhaps did not reflect the image of the Arab world, the Muslim world, Finland took us in, and other Western countries also did that. And it's because of that generosity that I'm sitting here today sharing this story with you. I don't think I would have survived. I don't think I would be making the kind of impact I'm making and want to make in my own country if it weren't for those opportunities given by Finland and countries like that. And I wonder, to build on what my sister here actually questioned, why, when we have the means to be able to actually take in people who are closer to us, who are part of the Arab League, why are we not taking them in? We have the means. I think the Arab world has the means to do that. And it's 30 years. The first respondent to the Somali crisis was actually the Turkish government. It was not an Arab country. And it was after Somalis were starving, there was drought, there was famine, and it took the Turkish president going in for others then to say, oh, we can also do the same. Yes, it's natural, it's a human reaction not to want to accept people who are not like us. It's natural. We think they will not fit in, they don't look like us, we don't know whether they are actually going to be a threat, a security threat, and so forth. So it's easy to reject the unknown. But once you accept the unknown and you accept refugees, some actually do go on to make a change in the countries where they've been accepted, and subsequently they can go back and change the countries that they came from. Although I am a Somali by ethnicity, I was not born in Somalia. I was born in Kenya. And I remember being deported from Kenya along with first, second, and third generation Kenyan Somalis because of our ethnicity. We did not belong there. And I remember being given a card, a white card that said, go home. And home was Somalia. And ever since, I have this huge sense of gratitude and responsibility to that country, because I didn't know I was a Somali until the Kenyan government made it quite clear by throwing me out. And I think that was the best gift that God could have actually bestowed on me. And it's that sense of responsibility, I think, that each and every refugee has to want to go back and avail the opportunities that they get in the host countries where they have been received. And it's important that we actually humanize these refugees and these faces so that we can actually see who they are. They're just like you. Here I am sitting. Would you have known that I'm actually a refugee? I've always said being a refugee is not a permanent status. It's not supposed to be permanent. If that happens, then something is seriously wrong. We should all go back to where we came from, where we belong, so that we can make our countries functional and better. It's a moral obligation. It's an ethical obligation to do so. And so I'm sure some of you inside this room, you're also refugees. And sometimes I call myself a former refugee, but I will be a refugee for life unless I go back home and have a dignified existence in my own country and not have to be in countries where I am a second-class citizen. feeling ostracized, marginalized, and stigmatized. And every refugee person wants that dignity, and they dream about that, and they hope one day that it will become a reality. And so as the numbers of refugees increase, their hope, I think, and aspirations are also increasing in the older refugee generations, because now it's like the second and the third generation. My children who were born in Finland are also refugees, although they are nationals of Finland. So I want to end by saying, opening our doors and responding to people in need should be an ethical obligation. It's something that each and every one of us should be able to do, particularly if we have the means. We can open the doors. And by doing so, we might actually learn something from them, and we could actually have people who contribute meaningfully to our societies and maybe bring innovation, and who knows, change the society by doing so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fadumo. Thank you for sharing your story. Fadumo is a proof that being a refugee is not a burden, that you can be actually a benefit to the country you're in, and you can be a benefit to the country that you came from. So I think it's very, very important to put those things in our heads. I'm a bit conscious of time, so I'd like to open up, and you guys come into, and you can come back to whatever you wanted to say about the other person, but I would like to open up the door for some questions. So any questions?
Good evening, Petra Corey. I am the Global Director at the Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent. Thank you for your interventions, and a few reflections and a question. When we talk about refugee crisis and questions you've asked, most of them is about integration of refugees in host communities. And the question that keeps revolving, and I think we are not touching the pain point of it, do host communities have the ability to integrate refugees in them? I think, and if we look at the crises around the globe, whether it is Afghanistan and what's happening now in Afghanistan, or the Syrian crisis and what has it led to Lebanon, and then as we speak, there is an Ocean Viking ship in the Mediterranean that is manned by the Federation with SOS that has 174 people waiting to board in Europe that no European country is willing to take, despite the fact that they've taken 6 million Ukrainian refugees as we speak. And that is part of it, is integration of refugees in communities and how well can they integrate. And then the capacity of the host communities to integrate. Even on the Ukrainian crisis, not all 8 countries bordering the Ukraine were as welcoming as what we saw on the Polish border. We know that for a fact because some of these bordering countries do not have the capacity or the ability to host them. So I think in looking at the refugee crisis around the globe, it is important to see and track where these refugees end up going and whether the host communities are able to live with the burden. And that is part of the integration and why it does not happen and why it does happen in certain countries. Yes, European countries do have the means to integrate them. However, even those that have the means are not willing to integrate them. And although it's not being said over the media, but we know that certain European countries have not opened up the door to take a lot of these Ukrainian refugees. And many of them are going back. The figure of 6 million have crossed the borders, 2 million has went back into Ukraine because of inability to integrate or find a good lifestyle or a good situation for them. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll get the ambassador, so it's 2 questions and we come back.
Thank you. François Barras. First of all, I wanted to say a remark about Geneva. Geneva, where you are, you know, the success of Geneva has really been the result of refugees. What watchmaking, banking, and pharmaceuticals in Switzerland all came from the French Huguenots in the 17th and 18th century. So really, when we are in Geneva, we understand what refugees are. My question is very simple. We used to make, or we still make a difference between political refugees and economic refugees. Does this difference still matters today? Does it make sense to make a difference between political refugees and economic refugees?
Thank you. So, who wants to take on those two questions? One? You want to take one? Okay.
So, just to answer your question first, for me personally, my personal opinion is no, it doesn't matter. Because even if someone is an economic refugee, and by that I assume you're meaning the mass migration that we're seeing mostly from countries in Africa or Pakistan or other nations like that, nobody leaves their home because they want to leave it. And if people had opportunity back home, they would stay there. If a person is hungry, they will leave their home. If they need to find a future elsewhere, they will still do it. And we need to recognize that if we don't also treat those people with dignity, the dynamic is going to end up flipping on us. We can't keep negating something that is so deeply in front of us. And to what you were saying about the refugees and integration. I mean, first of all, yes, 100%, a lot of Ukrainians have been going back home. At one point across the Polish border, the numbers that were returning to Ukraine were greater than those that were coming across to Poland. But there is also this to be said in terms of the absorption of numbers. I did not see, nor have I heard of a single Ukrainian refugee who spent one night sleeping in the street or out in the cold. That is not the case for other people. I agree that integration is a challenge. I, however, personally, again, my perspective on it is the fact that we even think that we need this concept of integration demeans our humanity and the fact that we are all, in our very essence, the same. Why, in theory, is it difficult for somebody who is of a different skin color, who wears a headscarf? Why does that all of a sudden make that person hard to relate to for someone who is living in the UK who's white? That's the answer that we fundamentally have to, that's the question that we fundamentally have to answer, is why do we even have this notion of integration? Why is cultural difference something that is so offensive that we somehow feel that it can't coexist side by side? And I do believe that right now we're at a very critical juncture in terms of our humanity. We either keep going the same way that we have been, we keep not learning from the past, or we decide to fundamentally change ourselves and how we view people who are sitting next to us.
To respond to the ambassador, I mean, I agree with you absolutely that the old-fashioned distinction between economic and political no longer stands. Even refugees, in the traditional sense, even people who are fleeing persecution, who are fleeing war, usually flee for multiple motivations. It's not just politics, it's economics, it's social, there's other factors as well. So it's clear that most people move for multiple motivations. The challenge is, and you mentioned the great city of Geneva, our institutions, our norms, and our laws are still based on that distinction between economics and politics. So we need to catch up with reality. We developed these institutions in the 1950s, we're now in 2022, and they're simply out of date. And we need to find a way to reconcile that. On the point on integration, I agree with you absolutely. And thank you for putting a human face on this. And thank you, Khalid, for making the point. And the research is clear, and my experience is clear. Where refugees are given a chance, they can make an enormous difference. But the beginning of the sentence matters, where they are given a chance. And all too often, they're not. All too often, they are put in refugee camps for 20 years, given a sewing machine, and that's it. And just the waste of potential is absolutely enormous. But I would also make this point, and I don't want to use the word burden, and I don't want to ever underestimate the potential of refugees, but I think we have to recognize that sometimes absorbing a large number of people in a short amount of time is simply a challenge in terms of housing and hospitals and schools. And I think we have to recognize that in the short term, both migration and refugees can be painful and a burden. In the long term, they can be the key to success. And the key is to sustain the support for them such that we can realize their potential in a few years.
Thank you. Fadumo? Sorry. Thank you.
I would like to speak to the issue of integration. It's a two-way street. And I think it's just a sign of respect to be able to integrate into the host society. We're not talking about assimilation. but integration is very important. Learning the language of the host country, respecting the rules and regulations of the country is very important. But also, eventually being able to economically contribute to the country. The host country is very important. Oftentimes, you will find when we go to countries that are not like our countries, we tend to have a small Somalia or a small Kurdistan, and we just watch our satellite TVs. It's almost like we are back in the country, and it's a host within a host, and a lot of people do not utilize the opportunities that are there, and I think that's a waste of really time and resources. If you left and you're in a country where you can actually study, you can change your life. If you do not utilize those opportunities, you're taking that opportunity away from someone who could have actually grabbed that and done something with it. So I think it's very important as the host country is coming forward by opening its doors, that also the refugees who come into these host countries should integrate. It's the least that can be done.
I just, as a last point, and I would like to get sort of, as a background, I mean, as an 8-year-old, first time I heard about refugee camps was in 1967, okay, which was the Palestinian refugee camps. And it's gone now, 56 years since then, and it's the same thing that I hear from that part. I mean, I've been hearing about repatriation, I've been hearing about opportunities, but then I look back at that, and then we talk about empathy, we talk about we should be looking at what we should do for our people who are coming out from Afghanistan, from elsewhere. But then still comes back to me, this thing about the Palestinian issue, where no one has an answer, or shall I say people have an answer, but they don't want to do anything about that answer. So there is no repatriation, there is no opportunity. So how do we catch up with that? When I get some of my British colleagues, smart British colleagues, when we had discussion about the Ukrainian and about the Syrian factor, and actually they came very clearly. They said, listen, we are racist, we have to accept that we're racist. That these are white, the Ukrainians, okay, and they are Christians, and we will look after them like you would look after your own. And my answer was, well, we are not allowed to look after our own as an individual. So I think we have that issue. But we should not, of course, degradate and say Ukrainian or Syrian, because all refugees, wherever they come from, are the same. So how do we square this thing off? I just would like to get a quick answer, because I'm sure a lot of the people sitting here, they need to get an answer for that. And be it a nasty answer, tough answer, whatever it is, but let's get an answer.
I think if we keep telling ourselves that as individuals we can't make a difference, we are giving ourselves a pass, and we're at a point where we cannot do that. Every small act of kindness matters. Every donation, every single thing that you do, every move that you make to raise awareness fundamentally matters. You might not see the direct impact of it, but it does matter to somebody. And right now is that moment where we either take charge of our own destiny, or you know what, we're just going to reap the consequences of it. And that's going to be on us. What we're seeing in the world today is on us, and it's up to us to try to shift that and do better and do more than just sit around and talk about it.
Khalid.
The unanswerable question about the Palestinians, let me say this. I don't know what the answer is, and that should tell you something. I've spent 30 years working on refugees. I consider myself an expert on refugees, but even the academic field has forgotten the Palestinians. Everyone has forgotten the Palestinians. I don't know anything about the Palestinians at all, and I've traveled the world meeting refugees in hundreds of contexts. So at the very least, we should raise consciousness about the Palestinian refugee crisis, not forget the Palestinians, and then begin to work towards solutions. That's all I can offer.
Thanks. Fadumo?
I actually don't have an answer, and I actually don't want to trivialize the Palestinian issue. I think that issue is really something that requires longer discussions so that we can give it justice. But all I can say is that, you know, there's a sense of fatalism when we talk about what the human mind is capable of doing, or even a human being is capable of doing. And I think if we really wanted to change the situation in Palestine, I think it can be done. However, we are not Palestinians. So if it doesn't affect us, we can sympathize when we see it on the media, and we can, you know, show remorse, and we can show emotions as every human being is expected to do. But ultimately, I think we just pay lip service. It's a tokenistic approach to the Palestinian issue. And I think charity starts at home. And this is where the Arab world can actually, you know, collectively show their solidarity and their might, because nobody's going to stop you from helping one of your own. So before even trying to do something anywhere else, I think the Palestinian issue should be the starting point where we can actually see what the Arab world is capable of. As long as the Palestinian issue continues, I think everybody knows that the Arab world is not serious about doing anything about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fadumo. I would like to leave you with this thought. Anyways, a quick thought on this Palestinian issue. I think the 432 million that you saw in the video, the Arabs, I think the word dignity, which was used by all three of you, I think only the people with dignity will look after other people to give them dignity. So the problem that you have, the 432, fortunately, unfortunately, reality is they should look at the mirror and say, why the hell this is going on? We should not blame others, which we do, which we're very good at. I mean, we are the best at blaming others, but we should blame ourselves. We should blame the person in the mirror first, because if we don't push the people, I'm going to phrase it as good as I can, people in the leadership position, okay, in those parts of the world, nothing will happen for the Palestinians or the Syrians or any. I feel, I mean, the Yemenis, we've not spoken about the Yemenis. See what's going on. I mean, this is a disaster. Iraqis. So we're having a disaster happening everywhere in our African countries and in our Middle Eastern countries. So I think it's important that people, we as people, we should be questioning ourselves before we question others, before we blame others. And we're all, as I said, we are number one at blaming others. And Arwa said something, but I didn't go to, I think the word empathy is an important thing. I think we do lack that empathy. We only have empathy to ourselves individually. We don't have empathy with the others. And that's a problem. So I think the change comes from empathy, and we should have that. And I hope that next time round, something positive is happening, whether it's for the Ukrainians or the Syrians or the Palestinians, something positive happens from our part of the world. And thank you very much. Please, big hand of applause for the three. And so.